Okay. Hello, everyone. I have 1 o'clock on my sundial. So my name is Jeff Horan. Um, we have quite a few folks with us today. So welcome to the 10th installment in our 12-part series, Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Tony D'Amato on using ecological forestry to support forest bird management objectives. So I want to turn it over to Shannon Connors to talk about the webinar logistics. She's with the National Conservation Training Center, who is our host. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, Jeff. The Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and Migratory Bird Program. And we will share this information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for attending these webinars. And just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. And to introduce Tony D'Amato and give us a little bit more information on this webinar series, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Shannon. Again, my name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist with the Forest Ecology Working Group. And again, we work with the National Conservation Training Center and with Migratory Birds to create this Forest for the Birds series. And Migratory Birds program is co-sponsoring it because of the Partners in Flight 30 years of conservation and also this recognition of the loss of 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. So before I introduce Tony, I also need to mention a few more things. As Shannon mentioned, you can get continuing education credits for the series. You can just look on the webinar flyer and contact Jim Siegel for that. Also wanted to mention that we're going to stop about halfway through Tony's presentation to take maybe a question or two that I will grab out of the chat. So you guys, as questions come up, you can start putting them in the chat early. So you don't have to be cranking away at that. And then I just wanted to also run a quick commercial for our 11th webinar, which is going to be on January 18th. And that is going to be effectiveness monitoring, evaluating the effects of forest management on bird populations. And our speaker will be Dr. John Alexander, and Dr. Alexander is with the Klamath Bird Observatory. So that one should be good. But I'm particularly interested in today's presentation, and I'm going to introduce Tony. Now, today we're just getting into kind of the conservation action part of our series. And so Dr. D'Amato is a professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology and director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. He received his BS in forest ecosystem science from the University of Maine, his MS in forest science from Oregon State University, and his PhD from University of Massachusetts. He was a faculty member for 7 years at the University of Minnesota and the Bullard Fellow at Harvard University's Harvard Forest prior to joining the University of Vermont in January 2015. His research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, and some of that you're going to see today. Also, disturbance effects on ecosystem structure and function, and silvicultural strategies for conferring adaptation potential with the context of global change, including introduced insects and diseases. I think you're really going to enjoy today's presentation. I've heard quite a number from Tony, and he always delivers. So take it away, Tony. Thank you. We're looking forward to hearing about using ecological forestry to support bird management objectives.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this series. Really humbled to be joining many of the great presenters before me in this series, and excited to have the opportunity to really talk a bit about some of the actions that individuals might be able to take on the ground as it relates to trying to enhance the diversity of habitats that are out there for bird populations, and really try to contribute to this grand goal of trying to stem some of the bird declines that have been talked about by others prior to this webinar. So what I'm going to do today in the next 45 minutes or so is really try to cover some of the basic principles that ecological forestry draws from, and really that have a strong emphasis on many of the attributes that we're often thinking about, at least at localized scales, and being important for generating a diversity of habitats for a range of bird species that depend on forested communities. And with that said, I'm not just going to focus on late successional birds, which often is where many people think of ecological forestry approaches, but really show that across the range of conditions that we manage for and principles related to ecological forestry, we can also think about the continuum of habitat needs ranging from early successional priority species up through late successional species. And so really highlight where opportunities exist, and certainly even some recent research findings exist that support this idea of integrating an understanding of both how forests develop naturally over time and the role of disturbance in generating many of the habitat conditions that so many of our bird species have evolved with over the past several centuries. So as that disclaimer said, this is not meant to endorse any book. The only reason I have this credit up here is that, unfortunately for all of you, I'm the one speaking today. But a lot of what I'll be talking about is really, I owe a tremendous debt to people like Brian Palak, Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, and others that for the past several decades have really been advancing a lot of the ideas around ecological forestry, and not just advancing the ideas, but also really trying to codify those into actions that can be taken in a diversity of ecosystems, both to meet commodity objectives as well as to meet biodiversity objectives. And so as I go throughout the presentation today, a lot of what I'll be drawing upon comes from kind of recent textbooks, as well as, again, the last several decades of discussion around ways in which we can manage the forest, both for traditional outputs, which I'll talk a bit about in a second, but also for biodiversity conservation goals, as well as a whole other suite of objectives that are critical as we think about changing climate and changing dynamics across our landscape. And so just to center us all and what we're talking about today, as we talk about ecological forestry, and I'll also occasionally say ecological silviculture is synonymous with this, generally the primary emphasis when we're discussing these is that we are managing forests and we are extracting wood products and cutting trees, but the ways in which we are doing that are really being guided by an understanding of the natural forest dynamics for that ecosystem. And so an understanding of the disturbance patterns, understanding of the structure and composition and the functions that those disturbance patterns historically created, and using those as a way to really come up with management strategies that can both balance ecological objectives, but also at the same time satisfy diverse economic and social outcomes. And so as I've already mentioned once today, oftentimes when people think of ecological forestry and ecological silviculture, they think of the pictures that are here in the bottom of kind of an old complex forest on the left, likewise old complex forest on the right. And we'll certainly talk about old complex forests today and ways to manage those. But the underlying premise of ecological forestry is that whether it's young complex, old complex, middle-aged forests with complexity as well, much of what's guiding the generation of those habitats is that we understand those types of conditions were historically created, and again, critical for many of the forest-dependent bird species that we're interested in. And so, those that are expecting an ode to late successional management will certainly go there, but really the goal is to understand how these principles intersect with the habitat needs of many of our bird species, not just those found in late successional structures. So to begin, just to give people a bit of context as this relates to other aspects of forestry, what I'm going to do is just use this table. I'm in the center of the slide that has ecological forestry and some characteristics of that relative to what we might consider a historic timber-focused forestry model as a point of contrast. And again, many of you are familiar with this, but just to kind of emphasize just how things are a bit different between these two approaches. The one thing that's not different that I'll start with is that we're still cutting trees, and we're cutting trees to not only create habitat, but importantly, supply our consumer needs. As we all recognize, we still consume a tremendous amount of wood products. And fortunately, that's one of the things we consume in our day-to-day life that's actually renewable. And so what we're thinking about with ecological forestry is, yes, we're doing this a bit differently than silvicultural systems and management regimes that were focused primarily on the timber crop. But nevertheless, we are thinking about this as a way to generate and offset some of our use of wood products, whether it be in mail order catalogs or other things that are coming to our doors every day in packaging or in housing, as well as other uses. And so certainly an important feature that's common. But that's where some of the commonality really ends. And what's different about ecological forestry as it relates to a traditional timber-focused model is that our emphasis really is on managing the ecosystem and maintaining that ecosystem and every component of that we're best able to maintain, both the structures, the functions, and certainly a big key area of emphasis today, the biota that depends on them. Whereas with a timber-focused forestry, obviously the main emphasis is on certainly managing an ecosystem, but emphasizing those parts of the ecosystem that really are consistent with economic goals. And that could include wildlife species that have high economic output as well, not just a timber focus. Likewise, what we'll emphasize a lot today is that natural stand development dynamics, so understanding disturbance regimes and how they impact forests really serve as the basis for a lot of what we'll be discussing today in terms of silvicultural prescriptions. Whereas our traditional approach to forest management is often focused primarily on more agronomic models. How do we optimize the growth of that timber crop, both by simplifying the system, emphasizing a lot of inputs and resources into the growing trees, and doing it as a way to really try to have some top-down control over how that ecosystem develops. And then finally, if you can get a dime every time I say the word complexity today throughout the presentation, but there's no surprise, it's emphasized a lot when we talk about ecological forestry, because what we're trying to do is really both value that, but also create complexity at multiple scales with our management, as opposed to, again, those that are focusing much more on simplifying forests for the output of wood products. And this contrast here is not meant to say that there isn't a really critical service that timber-focused forestry places in our world, but we want to make sure that we're also managing other areas for these other values that are really critical for biodiversity conservation. And I'll return to that in the end. So what I want to talk about is briefly, and obviously this has been discussed earlier in the seminar series, and Jeff even mentioned it again, is that when we look at forested conditions in different parts of the country and really parts of the globe, we see a fairly similar picture as is portrayed here in this map of New England in the upper left-hand corner. So we're looking at is a map of the northern New England states plus a portion of New York and Massachusetts. And across this map, the coding for these dots really represents the age that was called in that plot based on the folks doing forest inventory analysis measurements there. And so if you squint at the colors and kind of see the pattern out there, and on average, kind of the average age and kind of common condition across much of the region where I work in is about 50 to 100 years old. There are some younger forest stands and there are some older forest stands, but on average, our forests are pretty homogeneous, fairly uniform, and really reflecting kind of historic intensive land use that is now recovering from that. And so depending on where you work in the US and elsewhere, you might have more young forests if you're in a more kind of managed landscape, or more old forest if you're in areas where there's less active timber management. But in general, if we kind of were to characterize kind of the distribution of forest conditions, it's one of general homogeneity, both compositionally and structurally. And so as we think about, these declining populations, both of bird diversity, and so on the right, not that folks need reminding, but I just localize this to Vermont. It's just using the Living Planet Index versus time. And you can see the declining trend. Was really nicely described in the first webinar of this series, that when we look at these declining populations of birds, one of the things that's often pointed to is not just kind of loss of forest, which obviously is a real critical issue that we want to make sure we're minimizing, but also the forest conditions we currently have in the landscape are much more homogeneous, far less diverse than the historic conditions, both young and old, that were critical for supporting these species. And so with ecological forestry, a lot of what I'll be talking about is how do we take this current matrix of conditions, these forests that clearly are far outside, in many cases, the natural developmental model, and use active management as a way to restore some of that heterogeneity and just restore some of that complexity. So what I'm going to do is go through kind of 4 primary principles of ecological forestry, in particular emphasizing the first 2 principles that really deal with stand level management and some of the factors that we can do at the stand level, and use these as a way to really highlight just where there's a lot of compatibility between many of the underlying approaches to ecological forestry and management for various bird species within forested settings. And the first principle that I'm going to begin with is really one that was critical and a major change in how we think about forest management, and that the principle is known as continuity. And what we're really speaking to is what we have really grown to appreciate over the decades in terms of the importance of legacies of disturbance, things that survive from the previous forest post-disturbance, and their influence on both the recovery and resilience of communities and of that forest ecosystem, and the ability to respond and maintain functioning. So what continuity really speaks to is that we are doing silvicultural interventions that are focused on making sure there is a provision for continuity in structures and species between kind of that original forest and our post-harvest forest. And what this really is a deviation from what was the classic model of silviculture, where we were very much focused on the removals And instead, we're equally focused on what we're leaving behind and how that might function in that ecosystem. And so as an example of just understanding the importance of that continuity, the pictures here on the left, 1906, this is an old growth stand in Pisgah State Forest in New Hampshire. Picture in the middle of that all blown down is that same forest after the 1938 hurricane. The picture on the right is that same forest in 2016, where we have a largely kind of middle-aged forest, but that complexity, both particularly of dead wood, but also standing kind of surviving trees that's in that forest really speaks to the importance of those legacies in shaping what is a very complex forest, despite many of the living trees being relatively young and not overly exciting from the perspective of size and dimension. That continuity of structure is so critical for what functions out there today. So when we think about continuity and kind of the notion of managing forests, I'm really going to emphasize for much of this the idea of managing for complex young forests. And we'll talk a bit about some of those species that rely on young forests throughout the US and elsewhere. And when we look at those forest disturbances that generate early successional habitat, again, a key priority for our management of bird species, the natural agents of early successional habitat are very different than what our historic management guidance has been for creating early successional habitat. In the lower right-hand corner, we have a picture of a patch clear cut, and a classic, approach is put in a patch clear cut or a block clear cut, even-aged approach. And you'll notice there's nothing but regenerating trees in here, which again, I'm happy to see trees regenerating, but there's aspects of that stand replacing regime that aren't being approximated. The remainder of the photos in here are pictures of post-fire conditions, post-wind, post-bark beetle outbreak, post-tornado, post-beaver. All of these you can clearly see there's a lot of complexity in that early successional habitat that's not necessarily integrated and included. It would have been our historic approaches to even age management, and in particular, early successional habitat creation. And so because of this, a lot of the early approaches, and to be honest, unfortunately, how many folks think ecological forestry is satisfied is that instead of doing even age management, we just leave some trees behind at the harvest stage, and now I can check the box that I'm doing ecological forestry. And certainly that is a big part of how we think about ecological forestry in parts of the world like the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, where moving from kind of large clear cuts for Douglas fir and leaving a few trees behind, was a revolutionary change in the late 80s and 90s, when that became kind of the caricature of what new forestry, ecological forestry is. But this is just one component of what we're trying to do as part of ecological silviculture and ecological forestry. And what it's led us to do is really create a whole new vernacular that we talk about managed forests with. And so these ideas of leaf trees, legacy trees, green trees, retention harvest, these are all terms that are quite new over the last several decades that really speak to this notion that we are leaving things behind on sites where we historically would have taken it all. And really the only term up here that has any kind of historic use in silviculture are reserve trees. That's been used for centuries, and largely that was meant to be trees that ultimately would be harvested, but are being left for a kind of a longer rotation. So the photos that you're looking at today are kind of different postcards of ecological silviculture, and a key feature of all these is you are seeing trees left behind. But as I mentioned, the reason for that retention is not just for kind of meeting policy mandates or social concerns, but that we're trying to actually emulate what were more logical early successional habitats following these heavy partial to stand replacement disturbances. And so what we're trying to do is think about how this continuity, managing for that continuity, really links to different objectives. And so I'll show the portions of this table throughout the presentation today, and I'm going to focus primarily, obviously, on the topic of today, which is biodiversity conservation, so the center column here. But this principle certainly satisfies other objectives ranging from commodity production to managing for adaptation. But really the core emphasis of a lot of what led to the evolution of ecological forestry was around biodiversity conservation. And the idea being that if we retain some of these legacies in a new regenerating forest, we provide these lifeboats, so kind of for species that need later successional forest conditions. From the perspective of bird communities, we'll talk a bit more about this, but by having that mature canopy layer or mature canopy trees, we're providing a diversity of food sources as well as nesting sites. And then, of course, we can't grow large cavity trees very quickly. And so by leaving behind those large trees, either to die and live out their lifespan and become future snags, or kind of protecting existing cavity trees, it's a critical aspect of that biodiversity. So what I'm going to talk a bit about are some of the work that's been looking at early successional bird species and late successional species, and how they respond to kind of managing for continuity. And in particular, leaving mature trees behind in forests that historically may have been managed with even age methods without any retention. And so this idea being, trying to create complex young forests. So the figure on the left is from the Pacific Northwest region. And what we're looking at is site richness for bird species of regional concern versus the number of trees retained in groups on the x-axis. And so there's some pictures below of some group retention or aggregate retention of Douglas fir in Washington. And what they generally found was that when you reach about a tenth of an acre in size with aggregates, you really are providing at least enough kind of mature structure to capture the habitat needs, both foraging as well as some nesting requirements of many species of regional concern. And so really pointing to the value of these aggregates as a way to provide that lifeboat for some of these species in regenerating forests. Similarly, the figure on the right is from some work that Alexis Grindy led, working in Minnesota, and looking at areas where aspen was being clear-cut harvested, and then they were either leaving no trees behind, leaving dispersed trees behind, or leaving trees behind in quarter-acre aggregates. And so what we're looking at here for this graph is the abundance of different nesting guilds, so canopy nesters, ground nesters, or shrub or understory nester species, and how those responded to these different treatments. And what you generally found from this work, again, is that by leaving behind these quarter-acre aggregates, it was effective at kind of increasing the abundance of both canopy nesting species as well as ground nesting and shrub and understory nesting species. And those latter two groups, what's critical about those is that leaving behind these aggregates is not only leaving behind that mature canopy, but it's also protecting existing kind of well-developed understory layers at times that really will provide that critical structure that's not going to be found out in this regenerating forest early on. But we're also very much interested in those species that do rely on early successional habitat. And again, there's been a lot of work recently. This data that you're seeing on the left is from Michael Eckrish's meta-analysis, where he looked at a series of studies examining shrubland bird responses to tree retention across the eastern U.S. And so what I've pulled here is just the 5 species that actually had this quadratic relationship with retention. So we have chestnut-sided warbler, gray catbird, indigo bunting, mourning warbler. And so what we're seeing here, for all of these is that if you go from kind of no retention to 100% retention, certainly for all these species, they're not excited when there's an intact canopy. But in general, the majority of these species actually still have pretty high levels of abundance, if not their highest level of abundance, when there are some trees retained. And so many of these species that, again, we often argue that we can't leave anything behind because they're not going to do well in that habitat. A lot of this work that's coming out is pointing to the value of this complex young forest. And those on this webinar that are very well versed in the habitat needs of golden-winged warbler are already well aware of this, that even though we think of this as a species that really needs these early successional conditions, the most important thing as part of that early successional habitat is that we do have some mature trees, 10 to 15 trees per acre, that are providing those opportunities both for foraging as well as song perches for that species. And so kind of building in that complexity and continuity is critical. Likewise, not just thinking about kind of living trees, but also just deadwood and the importance of that. I recognize that where I sit in the Northeast, when we see logs on the ground and standing dead trees, my mind doesn't immediately go to fuels. And so depending on the ecosystem you're in, there can be too much dead wood on the ground as it relates to fuel behavior. But whenever we compare kind of the abundance of dead wood, both large logs, large standing dead trees and snags, between managed forest and unmanaged forest, it's pretty clear that a lot of our management, as well as a lot of our historic land use, has really generated forest conditions across the landscape and really across many regions that are depauperate in dead wood. And to illustrate that, I just have some data from northern hardwood forests in the Northeast, where we have volume of dead wood on the left, just comparing kind of old growth forest versus second growth forest. And I've also have a bin here that shows stands that are actively managed with single tree selection. And generally what we see, of course, is that old growth forests have kind of highest level of downwoody material relative to second growth systems, where selection stands, depending on how they're managed, might actually contain kind of intermediate levels of wood on the ground. Snags and cavity trees are a bit different, and those that do either work in uneven age management or have been exposed to uneven age management, one of our first priorities for removal historically from stands being managed with selection systems are those cavity trees and what we would call unacceptable growing stock. So what we generally find in terms of snag abundance Managed stands often have much lower snag abundance than both natural stands as well as kind of post disturbance second growth stands. And so again, thinking about how do we actually integrate that dead wood management into what we're doing is pretty critical. And so besides being kind of an ecological silviculturist, that includes being a morticulturist as well, and managing for dead wood, particularly big dead wood out in the forest. And so linking that back to our interest in cavity nesting species and thinking about late successional birds, many of those cavity nesters, trying to retain those structures through our harvest. And so even those aggregates that I showed in the previous slide, leaving behind groups of trees, if we can place those around existing cavity trees, both to minimize their disruption and disturbance via harvest, but also to enhance the functioning of those cavities. At the same time, trying to do things to create more snags. And I recognize many on this webinar have been involved with efforts to increase the amount of snags in the landscape. The bottom picture just shows some different approaches to creating snags. On the left, we have a high stump created over in Sweden, basically cutting this tree about 12 feet off the ground with the processor. Likewise, the pictures in the middle are from the Sini National Wildlife Refuge. Greg Corris sent these pictures to us, where we have kind of trees that have been deliberately girdled, trees that have been topped pretty high up to create kind of high snags, and then trees that have been impacted by prescribed fire to create different snags. And as that work and others have shown, depending on how you create the snags, their functioning for bird species can vary tremendously. And in the graph on the right is just showing kind of the proportion of area on these snags covered by galleries from insect activity beneath the bark. And generally what they found, at least in this work, is that trees that were topped tended to have kind of the highest amount of insect activity, and in this case, the greatest value for bird species conservation relative to others, just given the food source they created. So my final comment on continuity before we take a break for questions is that when we think about retention and continuity, there's this notion that this really corresponds to clear cuts. So if I'm going to be an ecological forester, all I need to do is make sure when I do a clear cut or I do even age management, I'm leaving some trees behind. I've kind of checked that box. But what that fails to recognize is, again, that many of our late successional species that require cavities and large diameter branches and large diameter trees really are found in uneven aged complex old forest. And so when we're modifying even our uneven age management approaches, we need to think through how do we actually integrate permanent retention as part of those systems as well. And so as an example, on the left slide here, what we're looking at here is a common marking guide for uneven age management throughout the range of northern hardwoods, called the Arbogast guide. And so we have trees per acre versus diameter. And this black line, which resembles kind of that reverse J shape or descending monotonic line, is what historically has been our target structure for uneven age stands. And you notice that it stops at 25 inches. That's the maximum diameter that's intended to be grown as part of this silvicultural regime. So if I want to integrate legacy retention along with this, what I need to do as a forester is really factor in that I might want to carry extra stocking. So this green elevated line are areas where I've decided that I'm going to retain some additional trees to serve as future legacies. And as those develop beyond kind of that max diameter age, will give me those larger diameter trees over time. And so thinking through, if you're working on even age management, how do you modify those stocking guides really to account for the fact that you want to carry more wood on that site for continuity, as well as beyond those diameters that we've historically viewed as kind of the ultimate diameter from an economic standpoint. So modifying those to meet that goal. So I'm going to take a break with a photo of a cavity tree that's built to last. It's actually from Greenfield, Massachusetts. And Jeff, happy to take a question or two before we kick back into more ecological forestry.
Well, thanks, Tony. So far they've been pretty easy on you. So there's no tough questions in the chat yet. So if folks want to put them in there, though, we're going to stop at the end. But I will say, but there were some interesting points made. So one thing that Valerie Chu mentioned was she said that we basically owe quite a debt to Gerald Franklin on ecological forestry. And as so you might comment on that, being a scion, and it really is important, for these kind of, to have signs from these people that had these thoughts and how we carry that on. And I think you and Brian and others are part of that. So you might, if you want to comment on that, you might.
Yeah, no, I feel very honored to get to work with him. And there's others, Jim Long at Utah State and others that have really advanced these ideas. And I guess, being a Northeasterner and a student of history, the irony is that the first use of the term ecological forestry was for Southern New England in the Journal of Forestry in 1942. And so there were actually foresters in the 30s and 40s really arguing that we should be emulating natural models as closely as possible. We all know some major kind of world events that occurred that shifted us more towards maximum sustained yield from our land for a growing nation. But Jerry and then others that have really had these visions that have, as you know, run counter to some of our prevailing models that have just really paved a tremendous path. And I think it's gratifying just to see the intersections between ecological forestry and adaptation for climate change, and also just a broader acceptance. Those pictures of retained trees. When I was working in the Northwest, a lot of that would be on an experimental forest, and it's gratifying to go to places now, and that's just standard operating procedure. And so just the integration of some of those ideas as well have been pretty amazing. And again, fighting those wars in the 80s, I hate to use the word war, but they were pretty contentious discussions. Very fortunate to have folks like Jerry and Brian that have kind of led the way on that.
Yeah, so that's great, Tony. So lots of questions have since come in, and I'm going to take this one from Karen because I think it's, again, and there's also a question from Laura about comparing profits if you're following ecological forestry. So you can think about that one for a second, but let's take this one from Karen. I wonder how the processes can include the presence of fungi as trees to select to leave for future nesting trees. Those fungi that will decay the wood faster. So, again, are we looking that close when we're selecting what you're going to actually leave in these retention areas?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're choosing trees for retention, part of what you're trying to do is really carry forward some of those elements, like a cavity that exists in one tree but it's not in another, or we often think about it if there's heavy bear activity on that tree versus another, or if there's the presence of fungi or lichen or some of those organisms that might not colonize every single tree. If that's a priority, it is kind of the opposite of how we would traditionally think about forestry. That's a tree we might want to cut out first. Now it's like those are the trees you might want to encourage. And some have gone so far even to do some inoculation with fungi. Particularly, I know some work with leadbetter's possum in Australia, where they've actually created cavities that way. Because as we all recognize, artificially creating cavities doesn't quite approximate that natural heart rot and all those things that can make a tree pretty attractive for a cavity nesting organism. And so, if you really are prioritizing that, you are looking for the if you can, the presence of that fruiting body or fungi. Often they're not always showing themselves, even if they're in the tree, but nevertheless, if you can spot them, should be a priority.
No, thanks a lot. And so, you can also, if you can answer quickly on the ecological forestry for profits, and also I'll mention that everyone heard me say fungi. My old mentor Elmer Worthley, who was a great botanist, he would have berated me greatly for saying that.
No, it's I think, and we're only going to further appreciate that their value, and there's a lot of work I want to talk about it on, even looking at how ecological forestry supports different populations of both beneficial fungi, decay fungi, and so a lot of opportunity there to enhance that. And from the economic standpoint, there's certainly there are trade-offs from an economic standpoint with kind of that production model where really you are devoting all that growing space. Even that arbogast guide I just showed, that I'm all of a sudden adding in some stocking that's going to be left out there to live out its natural lifespan. And so there are trees that are just not going to be put to market. But at the same token, it also presents an opportunity to work on some landscapes that we might not historically have appealed to with a traditional timber focused model. So, we'll talk about it in a moment, but, the Foresters for the Birds or Silviculture for the Birds program, a lot of that really builds from ecological silviculture principles, and certainly is a bit more palatable for getting landowners involved with forest management relative to some of our more traditional, often economically driven models. But yeah, there's definitely some trade-offs, but there's also some expectations on certain ownerships, like certification, certainly public ownership and so forth, that many of these principles, even if they're going to cause that ownership not to maximize net profit, are an expectation societally that these are public lands, as well as other lands that might be certified And we were expecting that biodiversity conservation is a big part of what's happening out there, in concert with some of those. And they're still cutting wood for economics, but maybe not at the rate they would have, 50 years ago.
All right, I'll let you get back to it. We'll be able to take a few more questions at the end. And then I will also say that Tony has said even if we don't get to these, he will try to answer some of these questions, and we'll send that back out to everyone in a week or two.
Absolutely.
Take it away, Tony.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so on to the second principle. And those of you looking at the clock, how am I going to get through 4 in the next 30 minutes? Thankfully, I'll emphasize just this one a bit in detail, and then the last two would be more of a broad cursory discussion. But as I mentioned, the term complexity, diversity, heterogeneity, all those adjectives as it relates to forests being managed with ecological silviculture are kind of the hallmark of these approaches, and that we recognize that natural disturbance generally, as well as the influence of indigenous burning intersecting with natural disturbance, those regimes really did create a lot of complexity at multiple scales, regardless of the region of the country and the forest you're working in. And so when we're doing silvicultural treatments, really the goal should be to create and maintain that through our management. And one thing I'll point to, is that, again, we think of this, and I've shown this table, that, the idea of ecological silviculture is that by creating this complexity, we're creating a diversity of habitat niches, tree sizes, deadwood decay classes, the spatial arrangement and kind of the diversity and density of trees and shrubs. But there also are kind of intersections with, the economics, so having a diversity of species and products, and likewise a lot of intersections with adaptation objectives. And again, I know Maria Janoliak and Stephen Matthews already covered on many of those attributes, but some of these habitat and complexity management approaches for ecological silviculture also, intersect a lot with our adaptation strategies. So when we think about kind of managing for complexity and managing oftentimes for late successional forests, which we tend to view of having a lot of complexity, unfortunately, there's been this notion that if I want to manage for late successional forest conditions and manage for old growth forest conditions, that really the final successful product is wall-to-wall big trees. And really what this reflects is that regardless of what forest you work in or forest you've learned about, spend time in, we tend to always overemphasize that pristine cathedral-like grove of big trees. And I'm equally guilty of that, particularly when I'm taking pictures of forestry students or for marketing purposes and other things. But what I'm showing here on the left is a photo from the 1915s from an old growth white pine stand in southern New Hampshire. Another couple photos from old growth stands. And of course, you see the people next to the big trees. And we've all done this either in our own work or on vacation. And you do it with a child, it even looks more impressive. And what we're doing, is kind of biasing in many cases the perception that, the old growth forests are just, wall-to-wall big trees. But when we look at old growth forests and study old growth forests and look at old growth landscapes and systems, what tends to be more common than old trees is variation in the stocking and distribution of trees. So these two figures in the center here are just showing kind of variation in basal area, moving across two transects in an old growth landscape in southern New Hampshire. And so at any given point along this transect, you might encounter some tremendous groves of trees where you want to get your picture, get your camera out, and unfortunately sometimes put your plot. So we've often biased plots sometimes to these spots in our research, but there are also spots across this landscape where there are very few trees, if any, right? And so this really speaks to this variation in composition and structure and stocking that was the norm, that complexity. It wasn't just this uniform single note. And so when we think about trying to manage for kind of old forest species that we tend to associate with late successional forest conditions, yes, we may have higher basal areas in that forest than we do for golden wing warbler habitat, but nevertheless, that basal area really needs to be distributed in a way that emphasizes some of that complexity. And so what I pulled here on the left is just a table from 2013 publication on cerulean warbler habitat management in the Central Appalachian region. So I have cerulean warbler here, kind of showing the range of canopy tree basal areas that was encountered under. Species like wood thrush, showing pretty high levels of basal area. So these are speaking to kind of forest stands or patches within forest stands that have pretty high levels of basal area within them. But when we look at the individual habitat needs of any of these species that we often associate with old forests and late successional forests, it's not just having kind of old canopy trees in areas with high densities of old canopy trees. More importantly, it's that vertical and horizontal heterogeneity in canopy layers, including having gaps with dense vegetation. And so the reason I have this picture of the silviculture with birds in mind from Vermont is twofold. One, those that are familiar with this effort, first off, know it began in Vermont, so I have to get credit to Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, as well as Vermont Audubon for Audubon Vermont for pioneering this. But also, a lot of those recommendations are focusing in on creating habitat for late successional species and doing it in a way that creates that fine scale heterogeneity. So a lot of what we're doing in terms of ecological silviculture for old forest habitats is that we're taking stands that have been highly simplified, either by historic management or agricultural abandonment, and taking those and trying to introduce heterogeneity. Can we actually introduce this heterogeneity and tree stocking and do it in a way that still maintains some areas of mature forest structure, but creates that fine scale mosaic of habitats that we know are quite characteristic of old forest systems. And so in our part of the world, we're often thinking about things like uneven age methods, expanding gap and continuous cover regular shelterwood methods. I know in the West, things like variable density thinning, the individual clumps and openings approach, both of which are really trying to take a fairly homogeneous system and very quickly introduce a lot of that spatial heterogeneity that would have been approximated by canopy disturbances and other things that create kind of that fine scale mosaic that many of our late successional species rely on. So in our forest, we're talking about kind of mesoscale and gap scale events. And so just to kind of illustrate this with some diagrams, on the left, I have some images from Carrie's work looking at variable density thinning as a way to restore some of this heterogeneity. And so on the left-hand side, we have this basically a map that's showing the density of trees over 20 inches in diameter in an old growth Douglas fir stand. And so the darker patches are showing where there are high densities of big trees. And so again, you notice that this whole figure is not big trees. There are these pockets of mature trees and surrounded by really a mosaic of different age classes. On the right-hand side, as a contrast, this is a 50-year-old plantation that's just been treated with variable density thinning. And so each of these cells really represent different elements of a variable density thin. So the dark cells are areas where they're kind of designated patches, so they're retaining these areas. The light cells are gaps they've created, and then the shades of gray really represent different intensities of thinning. So they've gone from a very simple forest to one that now has this spatial complexity. I'm using that approach, really one of the hallmarks, again, of ecological forestry. Likewise, on the right, an aerial photo from Wisconsin DNR lands and northern hardwoods. They're taking this very homogeneous second growth forest and introducing that fine scale spatial heterogeneity that's associated with a landscape dominated by wind events. And so these patches that really are meant to approximate blowdown events where some trees survive, but generally we have some open areas. Other spots where they're kind of reducing the density of trees to try to accelerate large tree development and kind of enhance understory growth. And then other areas where they're leaving behind, patches of trees with no management. And so creating what we often describe as these micro stands within kind of a larger stand that have that heterogeneity in them. So the last couple of principles that really kind of intersect with continuity and complexity, in that beyond thinking about kind of the initial treatments and what's being left behind and how I'm going to have, leaving things behind over time to create complexity. The third principle really deals with timing, in that many of the things that we care about from a habitat standpoint often do take time to develop. And likewise, the complexity that's generated often requires multiple events over time to generate. And so when we're thinking through ecological silvicultural treatments, a lot of what we're trying to do is extend the rotation periods for individual trees, extend the rotation period for forest stands, because we can create early successional habitat pretty readily. We need to be doing that on a fairly consistent basis to keep it functional, but it's a lot harder to create big old structures. And so integrating this idea of allowing things to live out their natural lifespans where we can, and factoring that into our silvicultural decisions is pretty critical. And so this notion of timing really is focused in on kind of going back to the question about trees with fungi on them. Can we conserve and maintain some elements of the forest that take a very long time to develop? So things like large trees and large dead trees, and also species like mosses and lichens that have very slow life cycles, takes them a long time to disperse. And so if we cut a tree that has those species on them, is there going to be an opportunity over time for recolonization and development? So really trying to maintain that across the landscape. So the point of emphasis I'll make in terms of timing is that, when we think about ecological forestry, again, and I don't want to harp on this too much, but many people thought, well, as long as I retain some trees at harvest, I've done ecological forestry and now I'm done. And my wiring, I guess, is a sign of Jerry Franklin, but as a sign that's a silviculturist, if we have long-term desired future conditions, and certainly this has been discussed in other webinars, and we have long-term goals for these sites. And so, yes, we can retain trees at harvest, but we really want to be thinking about what's our long-term plan for that site in terms of being able to maintain and enhance and emulate aspects of these disturbance processes over time. And so we talk about traditional silvicultural systems as being kind of the planned sequence of treatments to meet, applied to a forest stand over time to meet long-term goals. And in the context of ecological silviculture, really what we're talking about, again, is a long-term sequence of treatments, but the goal is to restore, maintain, and enhance diversity, complexity, and heterogeneity over time. And so we're really planning interventions over time in that forest to really enhance the structure and composition. And again, thinking about habitat needs for different species, provide that mosaic and renewing habitats that might ultimately be less functional and less desirable over time. And so zooming in on the forest that I tend to really enjoy working in, northern hardwood systems, if I were to start with this picture here on the left, so what I have is a diagram of a kind of a fairly homogeneous second growth stand, and then over time, how I might treat that. That initial entry, really what I'm trying to do is kind of introduce some of that heterogeneity by emulating kind of typical gap scale disturbance regime in these forests. And so trying to kind of put in 10th acre to half acre gaps, across 20% of the stand, really to give us that new age class and something that I can build off of as I work going forward in that stand. Likewise, I'm trying to accelerate big tree growth for future large trees, both economically and ecologically. And so doing things like crown thinning to accelerate that development in between those areas. And then revisiting that stand, so I'm not walking away, kind of set it and forget it. I've achieved ecological forestry. Instead, I have at least a notion and a plan that I'll go back out there in 15 years and then 30 years to really enhance kind of the functioning of those gaps, kind of expand them potentially using expanding gap regular shelter woods, as well as, thinking through what trees make sense to designate as legacies now that I want to leave in this forest and use for those future structures. And so thinking through over time how I'm going to do that. And so really trying to think about the mosaics we can create by having long-term planning, as well as the adaptive opportunities we create by having a plan going forward, as opposed to feeling like I've succeeded with my initial entry and not thinking about that forest again. So the final comment I'll make is our final principle is context. And thankfully, there's already been some awesome webinars about landscape scale considerations and how to think about stands and mosaics and the matrix. And so with ecological forestry, again, there's been a real emphasis historically on this stand scale and trying to kind of maximize within stand homogeneity and really differentiate stands from other parts of the landscape. And most of us on the webinar that are wildlife biologists, so that's not me. I'm trained as a forester, but many of you have always thought a bit about cross-scale interactions and how that influences functioning across the landscape. But ecological forestry really brings us into something we should think about, and even to think through that. Should our stand boundaries be permanent? Should we think a bit about how our management over time and the evolution of those stands certainly might create kind of intersections between different areas, and how do we kind of maximize the functioning across those different scales? And so really thinking about connectivity across the landscape, multiple scales of refugia. Again, many of the concepts that all of you are well versed in and that have been talked about throughout the webinar. But what I want to return to, just as a final point when we think about context, is that I mentioned at the beginning, the context for ecological silviculture and talking through, we have many forested landscapes that are highly homogenized in a major departure from what natural models would have generated, both from the early successional habitat range, but also late successional habitat. And so a lot of opportunity for management that could really enhance the functioning of those areas from a bird habitat perspective, as well as other perspectives. And so what I'm showing, again, just biasing it to where I work. And so it's a bit unique relative to some other areas. So I have a map of northern New England coded by forest ownership type. And so you can see northern Maine, those that aren't aware of it, huge amount of corporate forest ownership. But the majority of our region is family forest owned with some other really important public forest. And on the right, I have an image just depicting some regional discussions around, trying to stop the first problem affecting biodiversity, which is loss of forest to other land use. We all know we can argue about how forests should be managed, but I think we can all agree on, hopefully, that losing forests is a bad thing. So there's been some discussion and some really visionary work out of the Harvard Forest around we're trying to conserve, up to 70% of New England as protected forest by the year 2070, and doing that different ways. And so part of that being kind of permanent protection of wildland reserves, and other areas being given easements to try to keep them, from being developed but maintained. And so what I've done is I've modified this graph to include what many of us are well aware of, is that for different parts of the country and the globe, we're now talking about maybe 30% of that landscape actually being kind of protected, and in many cases possibly not managed. And so where does ecological kind of forestry fit into this? And what's nice is that there's already been folks that have thought through some of this many years ago. And I guess I didn't mention his name, but I'm a real disciple of Bob Seymour and Matt Hunter. I was fortunate enough at the University of Maine to have them as instructors, and they're highly influential, especially Bob Seymour, in my thinking about forest management. And many moons ago, long before we were talking about land sharing, land sparing, which is certainly equally viable and builds off of these ideas. The idea of thinking about allocating the landscape to different uses to satisfy both biodiversity protection, ecological reserves, as well as satisfying our wood production needs. I think most of us might already be aware of it, but over 40% of our wood comes from plantations, regardless of whether they're in your backyard or not. And so really critical for satisfying global wood needs. And so where ecological forestry fits in terms of landscape context is that all of that great area in between, the protected and the areas where we're commodity production focused, this is really the opportunity space for ecological forestry. How do we enhance both the functioning of those reserves by integrating elements of those reserves, natural processes, retention into our managed matrix, which at the time was called new forestry. And at the same time, if we have these areas that are very much focused on production, how do we have places where we might not solely focus on commodity production, but be able to balance and integrate more broad biodiversity goals? And so it's worth reflecting back on a lot of those ideas that really were critical in thinking, how do we balance these bold visions for conservation with some concerns around, forest production and how that might impact biodiversity going forward. So I'll end, with just a couple of comments, and the first being that, the beauty of ecological forestry is it's a silvicultural system and a silvicultural approach that's meant to work, with a given site and really be localized to a given region. And so the bottom left-hand photo, is of retention in Douglas fir. And again, many folks say, oh, that's ecological forestry. Well, yeah, it works really well, approach that way for that ecosystem, but that's not going to work, for a rich northern hardwood forest where we might have different disturbance dynamics and different approaches. And so really building in these principles, continuity, complexity, timing, context into your local landscape, and thinking about those intersections between the natural disturbance regimes that have predominated, as well as how this intersects with your conservation goals. And what's nice is that for bird species conservation, many of the things that are emphasized through ecological forestry are compatible with the habitat needs, not just for late successional species, but more equally important, many of our early successional species and the structures they need are compatible with these models of ecological forestry systems. And so it's not a take one or the other. There's a lot of opportunity that exists across that continuum. And I'll end, with a common criticism that, we're basing this based on natural disturbance regimes, how relevant is it today? But if you dig into many of the recommendations that are related to adaptation to climate change and managing, for mitigation of climate change, those are highly consistent with the different structures and processes that we're generating with ecological silviculture. And so, yes, we need to update and certainly evolve our understanding of what disturbance regimes are like in our region. But a lot of the structures that they generated in those processes are recognized as key modes of resilience. And so trying to build that into what we do is critical as we move forward into this strange new world that we're working in. So I'll end with that. And certainly happy to take questions. And as Jeff mentioned, if we don't have time to get to them all during the recorded session, I'm happy to answer those offline afterwards. So thanks, people, for your attention.
Thanks, Tony. That was great presentation, and I really appreciate you connecting with the principles of ecological forestry with implications for bird habitat, and again, and it was really great to see some of our traditional basal area kind of functions and thinking about what that means for us and for creating guides that can allow us to kind of dial into individual species or guilds. And so there were a number of questions in the chat related to that. A couple of folks asked about, are there tools and guides that we can share to help us better implement this and to share it with landowners to help us explain how this can benefit, certain things for them. And with that, I thought Mark Nelson did a really great job of kind of choosing his language very carefully on that. So I'll let you hit this question. So he says, Lott et al. In 2021 mentioned the need to translate wildlife habitat characteristics in operational metrics for forest management. So, in kind of standard metrics of complexity used by foresters. So how, are they out there? Are we developing them? Do we have magical indices that can dial us in on these things? And where do we find them?
Yeah, and it's great you mentioned Lott et al. And I've been fortunate enough both to work a bit recently with Casey and then Dave King and Michael Ackrish, and it is fascinating to we've been so siloed to some degree in how we think about management, and so being able to cross disciplines and think in terms of common units like basal area or other attributes. And so we're working right now actually a bit on that, trying to translate not just, I think if the question gets at, what's a logical stocking level, but also the complexity of that stocking. It's not just about, 40 square feet of basal area, and even the late successional species, 120 square feet of like wall to wall, just mature trees is not going to be, great for, wood thrush. And you want that to be complex 120 square feet. And so, we're actually talking Wednesday about how to link some data that we've been collecting at the plot level with some bird count data from those same spots, where we're going to look at some of these different structural indices and try to better approximate other ways for, wildlife biologists as well as foresters to use kind of easily collected data to come up with some benchmarks. But there's also some effort, there's two other pieces to that. One, there is an effort, kind of a follow-on to the ecological silviculture textbook that's now going to be an ecological silvicultural systems book that's meant to really build from the Historic Forest Service General Technical Report that took every single forest type in the U.S. and talked about the silvicultural approach for it. So what we're doing is actually it's an edited series that will take different forest types throughout the U.S. as well as a couple of spots in Canada and other parts of the world to kind of walk through. If you were to develop an ecological silvicultural system, for longleaf pine or for Central Appalachian hardwoods or for Douglas fir and coast redwood, how would you do that? And so we'll come up with a bit more, I think, thinking in specific guidance on, at least from the silvicultural side, how you might get there. But right now it's a long-winded way of saying there's not kind of an off-the-shelf guide, but there's certainly some efforts moving that direction, including geared towards family forest owners. And so, so consultants can use them as a communication tool as well as a way to guide some of their plan development on those properties.
No, so that's a great answer, and thanks for sharing the upcoming book. I'm excited about that. And again, so we've got just a couple minutes left. We will stay on for maybe 5 minutes extra to take as many questions as we can, but clearly we're not going to get to everything. So I am going to take this one from Dr. Brenda McComb, because she helped create this series and was a prominent speaker in our last series. And it's a really relevant question to know. And she says, first of all, she said, excellent presentation, but retention of living and dead wood would also store carbon for longer on site, but management adds greenhouse gas emissions. Do we know what the trade-offs are in terms of net carbon storage with ecological forestry approaches versus a more traditional timber management approach?
Yeah, and again, talk about people that influenced me, Brenda. That's someone that was very influential on my thinking, especially on morticulture. Someone that great thinking about managing for dead wood in the forest. And I think that there are trade-offs, and I think that the challenge is that depending on where we are along that continuum, if you're managing for chestnut-sided warblers and golden wing warbler, managing for those species and doing it with an ecological silvicultural approach, so leaving behind some mature retention trees and future dead wood is certainly better than from a carbon on-site storage standpoint than historically would have been maybe the classic just create even age stands without much retention as a strategy. And so on that end, I often argue the trade-off with just leaving behind mature forest is that you might lose that species from those systems. But I think where most of the battles being fought, as we all know, as it relates to forest carbon, is that Should we even be cutting forests? Is it better to leave it on site? And it's easy for us to say that in the Northeast when we rely on the Northwest for most of our wood products in the Southeast. And so we don't really see where most of the harvesting is occurring. But I think with ecological forestry approaches, there's still an opportunity that we know when we cut in the woods, we're dropping that stocking a bit. And so we're going below, what the on-site, carbon stores could be with no management. But to Brenda's point, we are retaining a lot more. And what the work looking at carbon storage has shown is that 50 to 60% of the above ground biomass of carbon in the forest is in like the top 1% of the largest trees in the forest. So big trees have disproportionate impact on carbon stocks. And so by doing a management regime like ecological silviculture, that even with clear cuts with reserves or green tree retention, leaving behind some mature big trees to live out their lifespan, has a pretty significant gain relative to traditional forest management models. And I think that the main caveat being that some of those management regimes, yes, those products are that are more traditional. The products are going into long-lived wood products, and there's a lot of excitement around mass timber and production of those materials. But there needs to be a balance that we still are storing pretty high levels of carbon on site as well. And so the principles of particularly continuity and retaining trees on site, but both to live out their lifespan. There's been some work that's shown that these ecological silvicultural approaches tend to be a bit more carbon friendly, extended rotation periods. All of those things have shown bit more gain in terms of on-site carbon relative to traditional models. But as we all know, pretty controversial and sometimes cherry-picked science to argue certain dimensions of how you feel about carbon and forest cutting. But ecological forestry is a pretty good compromise on some of those discussions.
Hey, thanks for that answer. And again, so I'm going to take one more question, and we will try. I just want to thank our audience. There is a pretty good conversation, in the chat here. And so the last question is more kind of how do you look at ecological forestry at the landscape scale? And I think you mentioned that in your triad concept, certainly. But there was a question that came from Kim, and she laid out kind of a complex situation, and so it would be hard to even. Again, I've read it a couple of times. It would be hard to answer this directly, but so she's talking about different seral stages at a given time, and then she's thinking about that, the juxtaposition, and then how you would fit them on the landscape, and that then led to kind of conversations in the chat about how that would work with private forest landowners, and then Amanda Mahaffey had mentioned certain guides for how we might pull those things together. So. How do you think, Tony, we come together as a group and think of this in a broader way so we can begin to have kind of a landscape design in place where you have multiple partners thinking about this in a holistic way? I mean, how do we get together and do that? It's being done in some places, but it's still not scaled up to think about it in regions and.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, as you pointed out, there's definitely these regional conservation partnerships and other approaches that folks are taking to where we do have ownerships that are maybe pretty mixed. It's not one large national forest or that's dominating or large areas of public ownership. But I think that the challenge, really, it is such a social question, and what I would argue is that in many cases, again, at least from the landscapes I work in, there's pretty high social acceptability of not cutting. If they are going to cut, there's pretty high social acceptability of doing that in the name of like interior species and kind of woodland warblers and late successional species. But as it relates to kind of early successional habitat, that's often at least again in this landscape the most challenging to argue for, and unfortunately carbon has only made it more complicated. And so really trying to understand and educate about the value of that, because I think that the concern that I often have is that there's going to be a disproportionate burden placed on public ownership, potentially to create that. Although again, there's some other forces at play pushing against any cutting on public ownership, depending on where you're at, as well as if we rely only on kind of the more intensively managed landscapes as our version of early successional habitat. It's a lot different than what I talked about today in terms of that complex young forest condition. And so really thinking through, what is the what are some strategies kind of within a region as well as within a sub-region where we can have that mosaic, and even kind of using examples of more heavy partial canopy disturbances. So I mentioned irregular shelterwoods. People get excited about those these days. But we've done work that even within a stand scale where you're not like liquidating the stand, but you do have some patches that are an acre to 2 acres, with some retention in them. That the early successional response, at least in our landscapes, has still been pretty pronounced in those spots. And so trying to integrate even within those landscapes where folks are less willing historically to do much cutting, maybe bigger gaps, but with retention that still might satisfy those species is critical. But in terms of getting at your question, I think some of the work that's going on right now in terms of trying to have these sustainable wood systems and a vision for the region that really builds in where our managed landscapes can even be over time, and how do we do those for multiple benefits. That seems to be where maybe some of the more recent traction, because as much as I love the triad, it seems like Canada really ran with it, and we're still kind of puzzling through how to best make that work in different areas. And so I think these regional partnerships that I think using birds as I'm a silviculturist, so birds have become a pretty big unifier of a lot of things. And so our birders dozen and kind of the emphasis of the Vermont Audubon, and Forest for the Birds is pretty much on, again, mostly species that are interior. And so trying to talk about that whole range of species we're losing and not making it be, well, on one end it's bobolink, so those are fields, and on the other end it's interior species, but we need that young forest condition as well. And how do we get that communication out there and think about it as this mosaic that needs to be rotated across the landscape. And so I think it's a huge social hurdle, again, on speaking from the New England and Northeast perspective on our side, to get more than just the public ownerships able and willing to do that type of management.
Excellent. So again, lots of virtual applause, Tony, for a great presentation. Again, you're right on target with what we're trying to do here to help understand the combination of ecological forest management and how that addresses birds. So thank you, and I'll just remind folks that one more time that we couldn't get to all the questions, and there were some very good questions in the chat, but we'll make an effort. Tony's going to make an effort we'll group them up and we'll send them back out, and it'll probably take us a couple of weeks to get them back out to you, but we will try to do that. We've been trying to do that with every series. And then I'll also say that come January, after we all enjoy a nice holiday, hopefully we're going to have John Alexander on January 18th. He's going to be talking about effectiveness monitoring and evaluating the effects of forest management on bird populations. John is also a great speaker, and I suggest if you can join us, please do so. And until then, have a great holiday. And again, thank you, Tony. That was a great presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Nice connecting.
Thanks to everyone for joining us.